So, if I might just introduce the panelists. On my right is Pierre Vintner from Fonterra, who you've already been introduced to, and Astin from Food Agility, but also on the Centre's Science Advisory Panel, and Cathy Webb from Seafood New Zealand. And this is clearly not Roger Cook. Somebody had to come off the bench. So Helen Withers, at the very last minute, is very kindly, I'm not sure whether she was coerced, into taking Roger's place on the panel. Roger, unfortunately, has a very severe cold and has done the right thing, stayed at home, for which I thank him. So, Pierre, I'm going to start with you. What I've asked the panel members, what the panel members have been asked to do is to speak for about 2 minutes about what they see would be key characteristics of a functional emerging risks and opportunities system in New Zealand, and if we can get some time, what part the Food Safety Centre might play in it.
Right, I'll start off first. I am very excited about the direction Nicola has taken this whole emerging issues and opportunity process. The bit I'm most excited about is that she included opportunity within her scope of investigation, because for us at Fonterra, obviously we've got quite a rigorous emerging issues system, but we've seen over the last few years that the opportunities that comes out of that system far exceeds the amount of risks that get identified. And once you get those opportunities, you can take them and you can build them into your innovation pipelines, and you can actually do some new technology development within the food safety and quality space, which is quite exciting. I would call out a little bit as well on Nicola's question on, do you go data center or do you go expertise center? Our findings is exactly as what you saw, Nicola. If you don't have the appropriate expert panel and the appropriate mix within those experts, you often miss opportunities and you miss gaps shown by the data. Risks, not so much, but really that opportunity space gets missed if you don't have the correct mix of experts in there. The way forward for the Food Safety Centre, for us, it's quite clear. If you identify a risk through your emerging issue system, that risk gets taken up in our risk register, it gets passed on to the specialists in risk management, and they know what to do with it and how to manage it. If you develop or you identify an opportunity, it goes into our innovation pipeline and it gets prioritized, and at that point we start the new technology development. That process for us is quite locked down. I would like to understand what that process would look like for the Food Safety Centre. Getting the data is one thing, but it needs to go somewhere and something needs to be done with it.
Key question, and we'll hang on to that because I think we do need to cover it. Anne?
Okay, so in thinking about the characteristics, I came up with 6 I's and perhaps a 7th as well, which I think builds on and perhaps reinforces some of the presentations, what we've heard in the presentations this morning, and also where we might need to go. So the first I is information, and making sure that that's accurate and that the source of that information is both trusted and assured. The second one is intelligence. We need to be able to have the mechanisms to convert information, because information in itself has very little value. It's what we do with that and what intelligence and insights that can we gain from that. But to do that, that invokes a culture of trust and working with people who are credible and considered to be trustworthy. And we haven't heard a lot this morning about culture, and I think that's something that we should be actually continuing to have a conversation about, because that's the culture as well as the hard facts that underpin the trust that we're trying to build. The third I is insights. So how do we use these tools that we have? How do we actually embrace data and big data? Instead of it being a scary thing, how do we actually use that to our greater advantage? How do we create artificial intelligence that can better inform us? And Pierre certainly alluded to that. The importance of predictive modelling, and we heard that from Martin, and how we might continue to use that, and how we might do some foresighting as well as insighting. I think that's the important part. The fourth I is international. And by that, I mean being innovative in that international space and being deliberate about innovation. I would challenge that we've always seen innovation as something that just happens. At the Food Agility CRC, we've identified that as something that needs to be deliberate. And if you undertake deliberate innovation, that opens the mind to a whole range of different types of thinking, which I can continue to allude later. Needs to be independent is the fifth I. So again, the transparency, and that comes back to what I alluded to before, which are the data standards, so that we can have systems that are transparent. And the sixth I is investment. So how do we get the dollars? How do we invest in the culture? How do we invest in the skills for impact? And I have one last one, which is 7, which is we have to also use instinct. We have to use our gut feeling sometimes, and that involves taking risks. Hopefully, with those 7 I's, we can actually have one we, and that is that we can actually be collaborative and open to do that. So they're my characteristics, Kevin.
Very good summary. Took a bit more than 2 minutes, but it was worth waiting for. Thank you, Anne. Cathy?
Well, a lot of the thoughts that I had echo some of Anne's, but perhaps I won't articulate them quite as well. I think for us, if we're going to go down this approach in New Zealand, it needs to be a coordinated and collaborative approach. I think we have to start with the setup, and we have to get that right. And that has to be a shared understanding about what the system is trying to achieve. So we have to be clear about our purpose. We have to be focused on what it is we're going to do and why, and how we're going to do that. We need to think about the scope, so what is in and what is out. And I personally think if we're going to go down this approach from a New Zealand-wide perspective, then we need to include risks and opportunities. I also really liked that idea, and I think that we don't focus on that enough. We need to be cross-sectoral. We've got a food industry in New Zealand, and far too many times we try and do things individually or in our own sectors, and yet we can actually learn from and use things that others are doing. I think we need to think about the process, so we need to work out how we are going to do this and clearly articulate that so that everybody understands what it is that we're going to do. We absolutely need to take the learnings from others and that have implemented similar systems, and we absolutely need to avoid duplication. It's critical in order to do that, that we link in with those systems that are existing, or at least that we build on them. We're too small in New Zealand to try and tackle this all on our own. The other thing that I thought was important is about the output. We need to have a clear understanding about what it is that the system is going to generate. And hopefully that would be information, and information needs to be accessible and it needs to be usable by those that it's set up to, to be used by. And lastly, but certainly not least, is funding. Too many times, and particularly in New Zealand, we set out to do something and that we want to do, and we set it up, and then we suddenly realise that we actually can't obtain the funding that's necessary to do that. So I think we have to start from the beginning, work out how we're going to obtain the funding that we need, and make sure that that happens.
Thanks very much, Cathy. Helen?
So I've got some notes here from Roger, which I'm going to paraphrase, hopefully in 2 minutes. He did say 3 minutes, so give or take.
We told him 2. We knew he would take 3.
He'd probably take 5, given half a chance, yeah. So first of all, he wanted to congratulate Nikki and the team for an excellent report. He felt it was really an excellent coverage of the requirements and so on. And so he had a few comments to make from the perspective of MPI as a regulator. We feel that it actually really captures the essence of the issues around the emerging issues system in terms of difference between an early warning system and the foresight activities. MPI and in fact most regulators require the latter, and it can be said that regulators are about 20 years behind the times, and certainly 20 years behind industry. And in this age of rapid innovation and customer change, we need to be really ahead of the game to be effective. We need to ensure that the regulations that we put in place are agile and flexible and appropriate, and to ensure that the food industry can be innovative, prosperous and sustainable, but that consumers are also provided with safe and suitable food, and that they can make properly informed decisions. We note that the report defines an emerging risk as a risk resulting from a newly identified hazard to which a significant exposure may occur, or from an unexpected new or increased significant exposure or susceptibility to a known hazard. This easily covers all the pathogens, where the organisms themselves are likely to be the same, perhaps with the exception of the AMRs, and also some of the chemical hazards that we know do change. It also covers the changes in pathways of exposure which follow the changes in current trends, which is important because that highlights customer preferences and also has an impact on our international trade. However, it is important to recognise that from the complete food system perspective, food safety needs to have a wider context to refer to suitability, which includes spoilage and fitness for purpose, nutrition content, health claims and labelling. So in terms of design for an emerging issues system, we need it to cover many factors other than the traditional food safety aspects, and that actually impinge on the food industry and the regulations as we know them today and what they will be tomorrow. So these include things like climate change, farming practices, animal welfare, novel food landscape with plant and cell-based foods coming on, and we've just referenced to the pea allergy going on at the moment. Need to feed the world, so the sustainability of our food production systems, packaging security and recognising inequality. The organic content is obviously important, genetic change such as the gene editing, consumer demographics, preferences, demands and trends, health and wellness, and whether or not the consumer can actually understand all of this information and what they're actually spreading by social media, and recognising the rapidness of that means of spread of information, as well as the affordability. So in terms of a proposed emerging system, based on expert opinion, there is a challenge of scale, cost and availability of sufficient and consistent experts for a forum. And Roger feels that perhaps we don't have this capacity here in New Zealand, and that we really need to look to the international organisations and do this as a joint effort, as food is a global business and the issues that we're facing are global. So perhaps this initiative needs to be in association not only with the Food Safety Centre, MPI, but also with FSANZ, EFSA, USDA, FSIS, FDA and UK FSA. And finally, if we could harmonise all of that together, then we'd be in a really powerful position going forward and looking forward to the future. The final thing really is about the fact that we need to data mine down to connections. So all of this is multifaceted. We may look at an emerging risk and go, this is BAU, this is strange, but we actually need to understand what the consequences of that actually is, whether that might be looking at packaging, for example, what does that actually do for spoilage, shelf life, labelling concerns. All of these things are impacted by these processes. So I think we should be looking at how we actually get that information out.
Thanks very much. So you've had a range of views, but also quite consistent amongst the views on the panel. So I'm going to open it up now to questions from the floor, or even from the panel. If the panel has any questions they want to ask their fellow panellists, very happy to get there.
Thank you. Dean Stockwell. Just wondering where food defence might come in, because it often can have a food safety implication for the consumer. Has this been part of the consideration?
Somebody pick that up?
I think it goes back to the point that was raised that food safety has become such an integral part of everything that we do. So I think Cathy's comment about thinking about food as opposed to our individual sectors, I think also thinking about the whole chain, we tend to still segment, is something that is very important as well. But I think also thinking more broadly in the food context about, in our experience in the Cooperative Research Centre, there are players beyond our sector who are interested in investing for the economic well-being of the country. So if I just talk about some of the partners, the strategic partners who have come into the Food Agility CRC, of which food safety is a fundamental theme that is part of the centre, our major investors are actually not the food companies. Our major investors are the corporate organisations who see the economic capability and capacity of Australia Inc. being in food and food production, so feeding the world. So, for example, it's the KPMGs of the world. It's also the insurance companies who see that if companies who are operating in this space have really good, strong food safety management systems in place, they're a better investment. They're a better risk for investment. And then the third aspect, the third component, I would say, are the financial institutions themselves. So NAB Agribusiness, the NAB Agribusiness in Australia, is the biggest investor in the agricultural production space. So they are also doing predictive modelling as to where they want to invest their money and who are the safer companies or farmers to invest in 5 years' time. So this space is also of interest to a much broader constituency than just we in research or the traditional food industry space. So we also should, I think, as well as food defence, Dean, in answering your question, is let's look more broadly. Let's look at the opportunities beyond just the way we have operated in the past. So that's a long way of answering your question, Dean. I think it's all in the mix for consideration, as is the much broader thinking space about where the opportunities might lie.
And I think that's quite an expansion on where some of the thinking was in the paper, Nicola, that we could perhaps take into account in the future. A wider group of investors. Nigel? Oh, sorry, thought it was you.
Nigel's kindly handed to me. Thanks for that observation, Anne. I thought that that's interesting, hearing about those financial organisations and investors and so on. And that to me brings quite a very much broader lens on the problem. So traditionally when we talk about emerging issues, we think about technical hazards, microbiological, physical, chemical, etc. But if we're thinking about it from an economic point of view, I observe that quite often where we get tripped up are in things that we would downplay. There are a number of issues that we've had in the past that we would write off from a technical point of view, but consumers have been very, very concerned about them, and it becomes a real big problem before we're aware of it. So I really just wanted to hear what your thoughts are about that, and whether we should be including that in our consideration. Thank you.
I think I think we actually need to turn the system on its head. And in the past, we have very much been production driven and operated on a highly competitive basis. And that's been the basis for the economics of particularly New Zealand and Australia Inc., because that's been our whole basis for economic sustainability. It's been on our ability to compete in export markets and trade, because we've always produced more than we've needed to actually consume. That whole dynamic is changing. So, if I take the dairy industry in Australia at the moment, for example, we're actually starting to talk about we're going to have to import probably, milk and dairy products, which is something culturally that is is quite non-traditional, but it's all about coming back to the economic base of what Australia can support. So I think we need to really think about that more broadly, and then also what consumers are demanding, which is transparency, traceability. They actually want to connect with the producer, the person who's actually growing the food that they are consuming. And this is where the opportunities can actually be created for us. So I think it's beyond the science these days, and we have to really think about and get into the mind of the consumer to actually start connecting with that. And again, you know, at Food Agility, while we look at the investment proportions, we say that there has to be a government partner, there has to be an industry partner that maybe come from social science rather than just, again, a food company. And we also have to have a government partner in that as well. So thinking about who's in that collaborative mechanism, which Nikki really referred to in the paper, I think we need to start thinking beyond that.
Thank you, Ian.
Anybody else wanted to comment?
Yeah, go, Nigel.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to ask a kind of very practical question. Is that we're in the process of trying to develop a system and using the Food Safety Centre to do that. We've heard the comments about funding, we've heard the comments about what the system might look like, who might be involved in that. I'd be really interested to know from each of you, what do you think is the next step for us to try and develop a working system that would be fit for purpose for both industry, government?
Cathy, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I would say the next step is to get people around the table. So you need your parties. So you need the academia, you need the regulator, and you need industry sitting around the table and nutting it out. Because you need to start by clearly defining what it is that you want, that you want to do, and without the people in the room, then that's very difficult to do that. Because you need to have those parties in the room, because potentially they are your funders. So you need those in agreement in order to set up what it is you want to do.
Pierre?
Yeah, I'd love it in 2 years' time, Nigel, if you guys would come to us and say, we've identified this big opportunity for you. This is how it's going to benefit you, and this is the money I need to make this happen, which we have done to an extent with the Listeria project, with the work streams that we're involved in. That's the kind of thing that's quite useful to us. It comes back to my previous question as well. Once you get the information in from Nicola's system, what are you going to do with it? You have to package it up in a specific way that you can go and sell it to that person that's willing to pay for it.
Helen?
Yeah, I mean, I think the next step, as you say, is really to get people around the table, because I think we all come in from slightly different angles. And certainly, this is, from my perspective, certainly coming in more from the risk side of it rather than from the opportunity side of it, just because that's the space that we operate in, but also recognising the fact that our regulations must allow those opportunities to actually occur. So I think it's really starting to sort of sit down and actually say, well, what is that long-term gain? What is the goal? Is it 5 years, 10 years? Where are we actually scanning? And how is that information going to get disseminated? How are you going to identify that which is unusual, that which is an alert situation? Oh, this is really unusual. Why is it unusual? What is actually different? For example, looking at social media and ongoing trend development. Should we be drinking raw chicken smoothies for breakfast and things like that?
No.
No, but I just, it's one of those things that you hear these things and you go, okay, well, where is the risk in that, or where is the opportunity in that? Because it allows us to develop mitigations. It allows us to put something in place ahead of time. So I think, for me, it's sort of, what is the platform going to look like going forward, and how are we actually going to be looking forward rather than being reactive? What messages are we actually going to be wanting to get from the system? And I think that's going to be different for all our different organisations that we represent. So,
Do you want to add something in?
I think one of the challenges in terms of, and this is true in Australia as well, because there's a similar conversation happening as we speak. And in April this year, there were a group of people from Australia and New Zealand, I can say Kevin and Nigel and Jeremy came across, and there was this conversation about how can we take this issue forward. And there were a number of things that were identified. And I think the first was back to Cathy's point about what's the scope, because I think if we start more broadly and then bring it back, that then gives a role for each one and every participant in what is a much broader picture. There was also a really strong conversation about have we actually got the right value proposition for each of the constituencies that we're trying to engage. So what is it that consumers want, and what are the risks, the food safety risks and beyond that might be emerging from that? What's the real value proposition here for industry? Because I think we haven't triggered the change drivers yet. We haven't actually tweaked the raw nerve about what is it that will give value from this system. Industry still sees it very much as a cost. Increasingly, there's a shift towards, well, this might be a good investment, but I think we have to keep working at that. Then I think there's a process of what can we collaborate on and what do we absolutely need to retain in the competitive space. And I'm not sure that we've actually defined that. And then we can go on to look at, well, what are the priorities or perhaps what is the role and the responsibility of each of the players in this system? And then what are the priorities within each of those areas for the stakeholders? And if we can look at sort of staging that, then I think we'll come up with this much bigger picture, which then allows the opportunity to invest. And I don't see, we need a champion, and at this point in time, it may be the Food Safety Centre, which is viewed as that trusted independent that can actually facilitate that process. Ultimately, it will come back to the Food Safety Centre dealing with the food safety matters, but I think positioning that within a broader framework will have immense benefits and create opportunities, Kevin.
Thank you. Is there any other question over there?
I guess, thank you, Ian, for that sort of broadening the scope of the food industry, which is obviously really important. I hadn't really thought about banks and insurance companies who make stack loads of money from the industry, actually being ones who could help fund some of, to protect their own investment, essentially. And so I guess, is that a recent occurrence in Australia, or how did they really become sort of recognise that the role that they could play?
So this was the creation of the Cooperative Research Centre for Food Agility. The concept actually came out of, and back to the point I made before, actually came out of a cooperative research centre in capital markets. So it was a cooperative research centre that was set up probably 10 years ago. And out of that, there was a spin-off, well, there were several spin-offs into commercial companies. And what that led to, one of the companies in particular called Circa, S-I-R-C-A, was a group of financial institutions globally who actually came together and invested along with government in this cooperative research centre. Circa now trades really successfully in the financial markets area, and there are over 30, I think there are some 35 research institutions and financial institutions, so financial institutions in the commercial sector that invest in this, they are members of it, and they access global financial data on a daily basis. So this is real-time data, this is big data, and this is financial organisations sharing information. So that's the concept that the current CEO, Mike Briers, saw the opportunity in the food and agribusiness space to bring that type of a model into the space. So the Food Agility CRC is now 2 years old officially, but I can say the whole concept started developing some 4 years ago, and you have to take strategic partners into the bid for government funding. And so we started off with 54 in the bid. We now have 43, and that's not because people have walked away. That's because some of the company governance systems did not allow them to actually meet the deadlines. And we've got more in the wings wanting to come and invest. And these are agri-digital companies in the digital space, as well as the corporates and more academic institutions who at the moment find it restrictive to come into the centre because of their IP arrangements. So the academic institutions that are currently partners in the centre actually have no IP requirements whatsoever, so they're willing to share the data, and so that's one of the hurdles to overcome. To briefly, just with due respect,
We just need
Kevin,
to close up, Anne.
I appreciate that, but one of the other key points I need to make is, in identifying the problems and coming together, it has taken some 18 months to get our projects off the ground. I cannot underestimate the amount of time and effort and willingness and collaboration that needs to occur to actually get the trigger to be able to get these sorts of arrangements off the ground. And I'm sorry, Kevin, for going on, but you asked the question. It's not easy.
It's all worth listening to, Anne.
It is not easy, but it is an opportunity if people are willing to put aside some of their predetermined ideas to get the outcome and to get the impact.
All right, I'm sorry, but we do have to close things off. I think that the conclusion I will come from this, and perhaps I'm a bit biased, and I'm sure I'll be told by others if that is the case, there is a need for something that's looking at emerging food safety risks, and in particular, the opportunities. So I think that in my mind, has been confirmed by what's been said. There's a lot more work to be done. And I wonder if, in fact, the Food Safety Centre is the catalyst to start bringing some of those people together. But we also have to take ourselves out of the science-only component of it, and we need to get into much wider fields. And it sounds to me like we can learn a lot from what Food Agility has done in fields other than science and food safety. So I want to close this off now. Panellists, thank you very, very much indeed for your time, and thanks for your participation. Thank you.